Fireburst has fallen out of favor ever since they nerfed its cooldown back to 1.5 seconds. With the introduction of tattoos, specifically this cooldown recovery one, I thought maybe it was worth giving it another go. I think the build turned out really nice. It's probably one of the less scuffed ways to play an Autobomber these days, but in hindsight, there are a few things I would change. I probably over-indexed a bit on bossing ability, but at this budget, it would have been better to just fully commit to mapping because the playstyle lends to a very chill, very enjoyable mapping experience, at least for me. Fireburst is a skill granted by an essence of hysteria that triggers on any hit. We're using Herald of Thunder as the main delivery method, so this build is pretty much an Autobomber or a walking simulator type of build. Since Fireburst has a cooldown, Ignite with Prolif is going to be the way to go. To get the Herald of Thunder started, we use Stormbrand to proc the Fireburst and apply a shock. Herald of Thunder lasts 8 seconds and each Fireburst proc will refresh it, so we don't have to worry about it expiring. Stormbrand also acts as a utility spell to apply a bunch of curses with Hex Touch for a significant damage boost for those extra tanky rares and bosses. It's also how we proc Fireburst in a single target scenario. Against Pinnacle bosses, you're essentially just Stormbrand build, giving you lots of agency to avoid stuff. We're also using Oriath's End and Fan the Flames for some nice explosion chains while mapping. Okay, so the main thing you should know about cooldowns is you need 52% increased cooldown recovery to get the cooldown of Fireburst under 1 second. It's important to lower the cooldown in order for it to feel decent clearing maps. Ideally, you want to be able to run past a pack of enemies and not have to run around in circles waiting for your Fireburst to kill stuff. We aim for just under a second because Herald of Thunder hits every 0.25 seconds, and getting the cooldown to the next interval, 0.75 seconds, is just not that realistic because of how cooldowns are calculated. We're getting 36% cooldown reduction from 2 cooldown tattoos doubled by the Warrior's Tail Jewel. There's a third spot where you can get one of these 7 adjacent tattoos within the range of the jewel, but I was able to get the remaining cooldown somewhere else, allowing me to get +4 all max reds instead. We end up having to take a few useless points, but it ends up making gearing easier. A benchcraft on the belt gives 12%, and 7 from a boot implicit adds up to 51% unfortunately. To get 52 in this setup, you need cooldown reduction on an Abyss Jewel. It's also where we get Corrupted Blood immunity. This amount of cooldown reduction also gives us permanent phase run on left click with an Anomalous gem. Now, most of the items I'm using are pretty self-explanatory. This character is built around Utula's Hunger, so I don't have any life on my gear. Instead, I have some ES for Eldritch Battery and a Divine Blessing. It's probably not the most optimal setup, but it's an easy way to get a decent life pool along with all the other stuff we want. I'm using an Eternal Struggle. It gives some much needed attributes. It's really quite nice if you can find some good implicits with the Exarch dominant for the 15% cull, at least for single target. However, I think a better option for mapping would be Strangle Gasp if you can figure out the attribute situation. You can get a corrupted one for a few divines and use the bench to remove the annoyance with a Tainted Blessing, then use Tainted Oils to add the annoyance you want. I'm using the Traitor, which isn't really too necessary for just mapping, but it's quite nice for bosses, and I'm actually relying on flasks to cap resists, so I wanted to ensure 100% uptime. While mapping, I use 4 flasks. Technically, some of them don't self-sustain, but we get enough charges from killing stuff that in practice, they're infinite. For bosses, I remove the Quicksilver. I also like to swap out Phase Run for Vol Molten Shell. Smite instead is another option. It gives a lot of damage, but it's pretty hard to get off without any attack speed. Since we're using the Blood Notch Immutable combo, we combine a low ES pool with the mastery that bases our stun threshold off of Energy Shield to make it so that every hit will stun us. Immutable Force makes it so that we almost instantly recover from the stun, making it pretty unnoticeable most of the time. However, these little micro stuns still interrupt animations, so a slow ass attack like Smite feels a bit too scuffed. The Blood Notch Immutable combo with Petrified Blood solves most recovery issues. It also protects against rapid and multiple simultaneous hits at the cost of a little tankiness, as in it slightly reduces our max hit pool. The one annoying thing for this setup is damage over time. We have no on-demand recovery, and Petrified Blood doesn't mitigate damage over time. In fact, it adds another one that we have to worry about, so our life pool is just cut in half. Vitality helps to offset some of it, and I have immunity to most of the common degens you'll encounter in maps. Ignite through Storm Shroud, Poison from a Ring Corruption, Corrupted Blood on an Abyss Jewel, and Bleed from a Watcher's Eye. Oh, also there are things in the game that are hard-coded to not stun, which bypasses Blood Notch. The only one I'm aware of right now is Eater's Inescapable Doom laser zaps, but I didn't even know that was a possibility until I encountered it, so there might be others. I couldn't really fit suppression in on this budget, so overall the uber bossing experience was kinda scuffed for the way I have my defenses set up. The single target damage was actually pretty decent, especially for the Stormbrand playstyle. The thing about scaling damage in this build, it's mostly pretty straightforward ignite scaling. However, since it's a skill granted by an item, additional levels aren't an option, so flat damage becomes a lot more valuable. Also, due to the nature of how we're applying Fire Burst, we can get away with lots of faster ignite. Now, duration shouldn't be completely ignored, since ignites apply the damage of the strongest ignite, so being able to roll multiple times in the duration of an ignite is kind of like a lucky damage mechanic. Now for tattoos, aside from the cooldown recovery and max res, it's mostly just all attributes. I'm replacing the rest of the int passives with chaos res. And most importantly, you have to take Hex Master to enable the cooldown tattoo in this slot, but it scuffs our damage pretty hard because we're using 4 curses with Anathema. I'm using a Journey tattoo of Makanui to change the Hex Master into Imbalanced Guard, which is actually an upside for how much armor we're scaling. It doesn't have to be Imbalanced Guard, you just want any keystone that isn't detrimental to the build. Any upside is a nice bonus. Now, even though I'm using an expensive flask and a double elevated helmet, this is still very much a budget version of the build. I'm pretty much using a fancy tabula, so I'm sure that what I'm doing isn't the most optimal, but it's still quite effective and I've been having a lot of fun with it for the past week.